Hi, and welcome to live from the Candy Factory, our Candy Factory Lunch and Learns. This is our first Lunch and Learn for 2021, and I'm excited to have Ed presenting today. Welcome, Ed. How you doing?
Good. Thanks, Ann. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Ed is a Candy Factory member, but he's actually not in Lancaster. Where are you right now?
I'm in Salt Lake City in Utah, so it's a bit out in the Midwest here.
Excellent. And you're at a co-working space there too, right?
Yep. Yeah. It's called Work Hive. So if you ever
Yes.
want a candy factory feeling, not as good workspace in Salt Lake, come check it out.
Yeah, no, it's good to know. I've always loved checking out co-working spaces all over. So today you're actually going to do a presentation, lunch and learn on the Jamstack approach to building websites. And as someone who has been in the WordPress space for 10 years, for myself, I'm really excited to hear about this new form of development. So I'm going to just pass it on to you, Ed, and thanks for being here, and we'll get this started.
Okay. Thank you, Ann. All right. Um, so today I'm going to be talking about the Jamstack approach to building websites. And typically whenever I mention Jamstack, the first question people ask is like, okay, what the heck is this? Um, so Jamstack is kind of the modern way to build websites and apps. So the Jam in Jamstack stands for JavaScript for the J, APIs for the A, and then markup for the M. And it's really more of an architectural approach to building projects. It's not like a specific platform or a specific tool that you use. And the core design around Jamstack is really meant to make the web faster, more secure, and easier to scale. And from the developer world and from the public side, those are all really good things. Okay, so really there's kind of two core principles around Jamstack, and one of them is pre-rendering, and the other one is decoupling. So pre-rendering basically means that your entire front end, all the pages, all the images, everything that you typically see on a website, that is built into these highly optimized static pages during the build process. And that all happens before you upload anything to a server, typically happens locally. Decoupling is really the process of kind of breaking the functionality of your systems into separate areas, so they're not really like all in one service. And there's quite a lot of tools for doing this. For generating sites, there's things like Gatsby, Hugo, Jekyll, um, Next.js, just to name a few. And the reason why Jamstack's kind of been rising in popularity over the past couple of years, and really the reason why it exists is really the kind of the explosion of APIs that's happened recently. For those of you that maybe aren't familiar with what APIs are, they're basically a way to do functionality and fetch data without having kind of a visual attached to it. So it's really like the gears that make things work. And what that lets us do is tie in a lot of these services into the front end and make things do whatever we want, basically. So the API world growing has really kind of accelerated adoption with Jamstack and really opened up what we can do. So that's all great. But honestly, a lot of people are like, okay, like I don't really care. Like, why should I care? What does this have to do with my business? So there's really four main benefits: better performance, there's security, better security, it's easier to scale, and from a developer perspective, it's a better experience as opposed to like the traditional way of doing things. So why better performance? The standard way to kind of serve a website up is that pages are served from a web server somewhere. So let's say I go to somebody's website. Typically what happens is whatever platform the website is running on sends a request to a server, It'll fetch the page, it'll fetch the data, the images, whatever, then bring it back and present it to the client who's viewing it. With Jamstack, because we were pre-building everything at build time before we put it to the server, everything's already available for you. And what that means is you can put all these static files up into a CDN or a content delivery network. And instead of somebody having to, say, like, reach a server in China, we can use a CDN that's maybe right next to them in a major city or like even in their country, and it makes just fetching everything a lot quicker and easier. So there's not really any server back and forth to fetch data and present information. So the other benefit that a lot of people tend to care about, especially in the web world, is higher security. So you're always hearing about websites being hacked or data leaks and things like that. And with the concept of decoupling that Jamstack really promotes, it lets us kind of abstract these server-side processes into multiple APIs. So instead of having one platform where it handles login, it handles memberships, e-commerce, we can kind of split that up into separate services. So it makes it harder for somebody to gain access to the entire system because it's kind of siloed into these different architectures. And the other benefit of that is because we're splitting these functionalities up into kind of very specific things, for example, authentication, we can really leverage the domain expertise of whoever is running that API. So the example I like to use is OAuth. It's a very popular kind of authentication platform that really manages users signing in and out. So you're probably not going to be able to build a better authentication service than OAuth is, or keep up with all the security that they are always on top of. So using them really kind of make sure you're on top of everything and you don't really have to take care of that. And that kind of applies to every service that you pull into your website. And the cool thing about that is, say my team doesn't really know anything about handling payments. Well, now I can pull in, let's say, an API like Stripe, and that'll handle all my payments for me. It'll take care of all the compliance and all the issues. So we don't have to hire somebody specifically to do that. We don't have to worry about any of the legal or like compliance ramifications that come with that. You just kind of pull in these different services and you use them as you need to. I personally think one of the biggest benefits is it's a lot easier to scale. So like I mentioned before, because we're serving all of these static files onto a CDN, going from, say, 100 visitors one day to 100,000 visitors tomorrow really isn't a problem anymore. With servers, you kind of have to keep an eye on the traffic and kind of guess, we're having a big launch coming up, so maybe we should update the memory or something that we have on our servers. And this kind of takes care of all that guesswork and eliminates that. I've seen sites handle millions of visitors from going from like 100,000, and there's been not really any performance issues or anything like that. So that's always fun. Less people calling you in the middle of the day, like, hey, my website's down. And then the last benefit I mentioned was the better developer experience. So this is partially a little selfish, but it's also like kind of a big thing in the developer world. So because we're splitting up all these services into like really specific things that they do, it makes it easier to kind of focus on just developing the login and then debugging that. Oftentimes, if you're working with a platform that kind of does everything, it's really hard to find, where the errors are coming from, what you need to look into to fix. Then another thing that I really like about the Jamstack approach is there's not really a hosting lock-in. So you don't have to find a host that, say, only manages PHP or anything like that. You can really deploy Jamstack sites on just about any hosting platform. And there's not like a single tool that you use to do this. So you're not stuck with kind of doing things one way. You really can pick and choose whatever tools that work best for you and your team. And then the other things are more like kind of technical, but everything's version controlled, which means you can really experiment however you want and undo things without any issues at any time. So, yep, that is why you should care about a Jamstack. And then kind of the next question I tend to get is whenever somebody hears pre-built, they're kind of like, okay, that's great, but that kind of limits what I can do. So that means that I can't personalize the site, right? And this is kind of a common misconception about Jamstack. Really, you can do whatever you want because we're using JavaScript and APIs and talking to different backend services. You really can, you've opened up the doors for kind of unlimited personalization and enhancement. So you can build everything from a fully dynamic website to a web app based specifically on the user that is using it. If you can add logins, you can add content based on different regions, you can add content based on who's logged in, things like that. So really you can, like I've built everything from kind of cabin builder apps to podcast hosting websites to marketing quizzes. So there's not really anything that I've run into that you can't really personalize and make interactive. Like for example, I'm currently kind of working on a crowd issue reporting system, and that serves up different information based on who's logged in or even what region of the states you're in. And that's all possible with the Jamstack approach. So this idea of like you can't personalize it or it's kind of set in stone, that's not true. And then the biggest question probably out of all of those is like, how is this different from WordPress? So I think the best way to answer this is kind of to start with like what WordPress really does. Everyone's pretty familiar with it. WordPress runs about 25% of all sites on the website, on the web, sorry. So with a traditional CMS like WordPress, it's either a software that you install and have to manage, or you have kind of a managed server environment. And it usually comes with like some sort of a WYSIWYG editor, and it's kind of tied to editing and presenting information on a web page. I think those are kind of the main focuses of WordPress. It's really kind of web specific. So with the Jamstack approach, like a lot of the time, you still want to have that easy editing functionality and be able to have different content and use different CMSs. And Jamstack kind of provides all that with this concept of a headless CMS. So we all know what a CMS is. It's a system that provides you a way to author content. And the difference between the headless CMS and say WordPress is that your CMS is now not really tied to a particular output. Like in WordPress, if let's say you edit a block in Gutenberg, you're really editing it for that page that you're working on. Versus with a headless CMS, that content really can be put anywhere you want. So what that means is you can author your content in one place and you can serve it to multiple front ends. You can serve it to web apps, mobile apps, digital kiosks. You're not really tied to like just putting information on a web page. I think there's definitely some pros and cons to using WordPress, and then there's pros and cons to using like a Jamstack and headless CMS approach as well. So I'll just go over some of the pros of a headless CMS and a Jamstack approach, because that's probably what most people aren't as familiar with. So you get a faster editing experience because you don't have to edit the content and then render that on a page. You don't really have to deal with the backend rendering, the rendering side of things with a headless CMS. It's really more concerned about just putting your content in there. The other one, like I quickly touched on, is you can manage content over more channels. With the headless Jamstack approach, you're not tied to a website. Like I mentioned before, you can serve the content on apps, you can serve it on websites. You can kind of pull in your internal content that you use for the team, like documentation in one space. And that doesn't really have to go on a web page anywhere. It can just kind of live within this content management system. The other great thing that you get by using like a headless CMS approach with Jamstack is really at any point you can move away from the front end framework that you're using and go to somewhere else. And your CMS doesn't have to change. All your content just kind of stays where it's at, and you can plug and play different front end frameworks. And that's really helpful because in the front end world, these frameworks just kind of like really come and go with the tides. So not being locked into, let's say, the popular framework of today that's no longer popular next year is really great, because you don't have to migrate all your content. You just kind of update the year front end and you're good to go. And I think we're gonna, this kind of a recurring theme, easier scaling. Because you're managing all of your content from a single source, you can change your tooling at any time. You can send all of this content to be pre-built with some of the web builders, like I mentioned, with the pre-rendering. And then there's a variety of different cloud-based hosting services that you can use to do that. Cool. So some fun examples of things you can do. Obviously, websites and web apps, authoring content for those and building those, that's all possible. You can do things like managing content for voice assistants. So if your team is using, Alexa or Google Home or whatever else you have, you can store all of that in your headless CMS. And because of the Jamstack approach of kind of siloing these different things, you can serve that up there. You can build content for digital kiosks, for print websites, for documentation. It's kind of really, the doors are open. And I think especially with COVID, one of the biggest things that you can do with this is kind of have like a centralized e-commerce management. So let's say you have like a big warehouse and you have your inventory for multiple shops that you have. Traditionally with something like, say, Shopify or a WooCommerce, you're kind of tied to having that inventory be presented to only that store. So with more of like a Jamstack headless approach, you can kind of have a centralized inventory and then push all of that to your specific stores and kind of manage that from one area. Cool. So at the end of the day, like, we all know that WordPress is a reliable tool, and now there's this new thing called Jamstack, and it really isn't like WordPress is better than Jamstack or Jamstack is better than WordPress. This is more about like presenting an alternative that might be a better fit for the project that you're on or the team that you're working with. So really, you should kind of evaluate what you need for each project and then pick the technologies to fix that goal. So if it's WordPress, that's fantastic. If it's headless CMS and Jamstack, that's great too. So there's not really a right and wrong. And that's kind of an ongoing battle in the developer world, I think, for those people who tend to kind of lean to one side or the other. So if you're interested in learning more about Jamstack, specifically about different site generators or different headless CMS options that I mentioned, we have these 3 resources here. You're more than welcome to go to those. There's a lot of great information on there, and you can kind of start your journey and go from there. So yep, that is what I have today about Jamstack. So if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them in. All right.
Hey Ed, thanks so much. I think this was really helpful to kind of get an understanding of this new system. And we did have a question. I think you answered a little bit of it. And I'm just going to pull that up from Pete. Kind of how does it handle e-commerce? And I want to build on that just a little bit because I have some questions. So, for example, if you build this inventory system on Jamstack, right? You can push out your inventory to multiple like sites like Shopify and so on.
Yep.
They all integrate with it.
Yes. So as long as your platform that you're using can accept JSON, which is kind of the standard web for doing anything with data, you can fetch data from these platforms. So everything like a Shopify, WooCommerce, kind of all your major e-commerce platforms, they can read all of this information and then pull it into their stores. So there is it is a little more difficult because you are pulling from these multiple sources, but it can definitely be done.
Got it. Got it. So that might help someone who's like, I have multiple storefronts,
Yeah.
and I only want to be updating inventory in one place. And
Yeah.
the team can have access to that one thing instead of everything that's out there.
Yeah.
And that's where it can go.
Yep.
We have another question here. So let me pull this up. You can read this.
Yep. Do you want me to answer Pete's question a little?
Oh,
More?
sure. Yeah. No, go for
cool. Pete, so you're asking how it handles e-commerce. So there's kind of 2 approaches that you can take. One is there are kind of entire platforms built around this approach of Jamstack and headless e-commerce. So you can have kind of the experience that you have with a Shopify or a WooCommerce, but it's on this different platform. So that's kind of one approach you can take. And then at that point, it's not really any different than what you're currently used to. The other approach, I kind of touched on lightly, was using a headless CMS Jamstack approach more to just handle inventory or handle whatever other kind of information. And then you'll take that data and then maybe tie that into a Shopify or tie that into a WooCommerce, or even just have your own really simple storefront website that you have. So that's kind of the 2 different things. There's a lot of fun things you can do with e-commerce and Jamstack.
So What I'm getting from you, Ed, is that it's very flexible.
Yes.
So yeah, where WordPress, like you're saying, if there's a builder, you're kind of stuck with the builder, you're stuck with the plugins, but it's here you can add more apps, more APIs. There's just easier to use. We have another question. Let me pull that up.
Yes. Eurosource. I'm not sure what your name is, but definitely. You don't have to have a developer on your team to be able to do things like change paragraphs or content. So I can send out those links to those resources that I shared earlier. Underneath the headless CMS and the page builder section, there's entire platforms that have more like a click and edit experience. Maybe let's say you're used to a Squarespace or something like that. That whole experience of just being able to log in, change your content, and have it be updated. There's definitely tools out there for that. So you don't have to go in and actually edit the code to make all these changes. So yeah, definitely tools for that. Pete, you say you provide credit card processing, Shopify and WooCommerce plays nicely, and Stripe blocks us out. I think this is great. So this is one of the cool things about using this approach is you don't have to use Stripe. You can run all your payments through Shopify, WooCommerce, PayPal, whatever third-party payment provider that you're using. I just kind of use Stripe as an example to do things. So it really opens up with the doors to what you can do with it. Cool. And Joshua. Yes. Kind of. So you can do one of two things. You can update content locally. Let's say you want to change the entire structure of your header. You'll either do that in your page builder or your code. You can do that locally and push it up, or you can log into one of these platforms, whether it be a page builder, Headless CMS, and that's actually going to be online. And what that does is then it will pre-build that and then upload it. So you don't have to necessarily do it locally. You can do it on the web, but yeah, it still goes through that same kind of process of pre-building and publishing that out there. Thank you for asking that, and I can always expand on that too. Randall, thank you for dropping your name. I'm just reading through the questions and answering them, so if anyone has any more, cool. Jonathan, hey, nice to see you. Could this link to QuickBooks Point of Sale 2013 and pull inventory into a web page? Can you push inventory to WordPress and WooCommerce? Yeah, I think as long as QuickBooks has an API that you can pull from there, you could always do like, you get your data from QuickBooks, you put it into this central location, and then you push that out to WordPress and WooCommerce. So it can definitely be like this middle ground that you use to tie those into. I'm not really familiar with the QuickBooks point of sale and how that integrates with WordPress and WooCommerce. So if there's not like a direct tie into both of those, you can definitely use this as more of like a middle ground to fetch that data and then federate that out to WordPress. Cool. Pete Beckery. When we shop small, we need to extend that to services and avoid Stripe and Square. Yes, I totally agree. So you can kind of tie in, as long as the payment platform that you're using has like a web component to it where you can access that data, you can definitely do that. Next, Joshua Labs, so much faster than dynamically showing from a database. I'm happy to kind of share different examples for you about like the whole fast aspect, but it is really fast. Like I've had to like actually build in loading indicators because the changes going from like one page to another page are too abrupt, which is kind of anti-pattern, but I've done that before. So you can go from like taking 5 to 10 seconds to load a page to having it load within like 200 milliseconds. That's generally the average. So it's definitely a lot quicker. And yeah, like you mentioned, you don't, depending on your situation, you don't necessarily need to be fetching all the data from the database every single time. You could have that all available and pre-built. So that could even cut down on your costs of data transfer using your servers or whatever else is out there. Okay.
Speaking to speed, you were saying about scalability, right? Like traffic. So, for example, you're rolling out a big campaign where you've seen this before, and you mentioned it, that sites will just crash or something happens where, you know, all of a sudden you get some press and all of a sudden you went from 100 views a day to like 1 million. And you can't necessarily scale for that. Well, you're saying that this allows you to do that. Can you elaborate just a little bit more on that?
Yeah. Okay. So specifically with WordPress, over the past couple of years with some of these managed host providers, they've gotten a lot better at kind of handling all that caching and everything for you. But the idea is, so because we're pre-building all of these web pages, data, whatever, and serving them up on a CDN, there's no kind of one server that all of this traffic is kind of flooding to anymore. It's really going to all of these different distribution networks that are out there. So let's say you have users from Utah logging in and or trying to visit your website. So they're going to be directed to the Utah, potentially, I'm just kind of making this up, the Utah CDN location. Your PA users are going to be directed to your PA CDN. And that kind of splits up the traffic for like one thing, so that you're no longer driving everyone kind of to the same point. And then the other thing is, because all of this is already pre-built and on the server, you don't have to have the extra overhead of going and fetching data and then presenting it back to people. So that really cuts down on that server processes as well. Yep.
Okay, and so how has this been adopted by developers? Like,
Yeah.
what percentage of developers are choosing to now build on these systems? And what is so the client response to this? Obviously, the client wants a fast system that can do these things and their site not crash and maybe have a one source for inventory, all of those pros that you talked about. So what is the adoption from the developer side and also the client side with the, like, we understand WordPress, we understand some of these things, this is
Yeah.
obviously new.
Yep.
What are you seeing on that? And then I think there's something from Jonathan we can put up to them.
For sure. Yeah. So the developer community, I think there tends to be like three camps. One is like, WordPress is the king, nothing is ever going to beat it, which is understandable because WordPress powers almost a quarter of all websites. Then there's the other camp that's like, no, you're a bunch of old people with beards in your corner shaking your fist at the cloud. Like, this is the way to go. You're going to be left behind. And then there's like the middle camp, which I think I'm definitely a part of, which is these are both really good platforms. And this is kind of the whole point of the web, is to try new things and see what works and what doesn't work. So I think it's really like a mix between those. There definitely tends to be more of a polarization between WordPress and non-WordPress people, and less people in the middle ground. As far as adoption, I think, so on the Jamstack side, it's definitely a lot smaller than WordPress. I think right now there's only about, let's say if you're looking at the top 100 websites based on like Alexa rankings or something like that, I think maybe 4 to 6% of those are more Jamstack sites. And I think a lot of this is kind of what you mentioned. WordPress has been around for quite a bit longer. It has a really good reputation. Everyone kind of knows what they're going into. So it's seen as less of a risk, I think, right now for people to use WordPress than Jamstack. On the other end, if you say like, hey, we can give a better developer experience or maybe take care of some of these load times that you've been having issues with or scaling issues, then people are a lot more open to be like, okay, like we're willing to try this platform and see what happens. From a client perspective, I don't think clients really care what the tool is. Like it could be WordPress, it could be Squarespace, whatever it is. At the end of the day, they're really focused on, I need to do this thing and I don't want to have any problems with it. So especially in Pennsylvania, where WordPress is really widely known, I do think it's a harder sell because everyone's like, well, we know WordPress works. Like, why should we try this newfangled technology that not a lot of people use right now? And then there's other people who are like, all right, well, can I still edit my content without having to go into the code? And now I don't have to deal with plugins. Cool, I'm on board. So that's kind of been the response that I've seen.
Right. So it is easy for someone if they're like, well, we have an in-house person. Because, like, a lot of smaller businesses will tend to do that, right? Like, I have an in-house person. We want to train them on updating content.
Yeah.
We want to, like, a blog roll style kind of news feed. And that's all doable. And it can be a very user friendly interface. On the development end, does it require more upfront work than, let's say, building out a WordPress site?
Um, I think it's about the same, to be honest. If you're doing, okay, so if you are using, let's say, Divi or another page builder, I do
Mhm.
think it is less work to use WordPress and Divi to kind of set up your pages and add in a blog. You can get up and running pretty quick. A lot of people tend to go the custom theme route. So if you're doing that, I think it's about the same work. But
Got
on the
it.
other hand, like with some of these platforms, it really is almost like a one-click experience, kind of like the WordPress setup, where you sign up for this platform and it will set up the content management and an entire front end for you. And then at that point, all you're doing is really going in and doing basically what you're doing with say Divi, where you're just dragging around blocks and editing content.
Got it.
So yeah,
Got it. Here is a comment from
from
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Yes, exactly. Um, it's definitely strange where you're like, hey, I made this too fast, and now people are like, you don't expect. Everyone's used to a certain behavior of like, hey, this needs some time to load. So if you have that jarring transition, oftentimes the way to deal with that is either add some fancy animations or really just add a loading indicator, even though you don't technically need one. So yeah, definitely that.
That's interesting. That things could be loading too fast. How does this play with Google and SEO? If someone's saying, okay, well, this sounds interesting, it's flexible, it allows me to do
Mhm,
some things in one source that feeds multiple sources, which is better than me going into each source.
mhm.
Um, how is Google responding? What's the SEO side of this?
Yep. I can only touch a little bit on this because I'm definitely not an SEO expert, but I think like from what I understand, one of the bigger things that Google looks at is page load times. And I don't know, how much weight this actually has on your rankings or anything like that, but I think you're for the most part definitely going to win with a Jamstack approach for page loads. It's going to be a lot quicker than using a WordPress out of the box. Um, there's definitely ways you can speed WordPress up and put all the content in the CDN, which could make it about equal. But um, I think the performance definitely is a good factor for SEO. The other thing is like you still have full control over your titles, your descriptions, all of your typical things you might do in like a Yoast SEO plugin. So that's all configurable or available out of the box with these platforms. As far as like any other SEO things, I personally don't know enough about SEO to be like, yeah, it does this or it does that.
Got it. Well, as long as you're adding the metadata and what
Mhm.
you're saying, if you have control over titles and if load speed is good, and um, so do you think this is the way things are going? Is this the future?
I've certainly bet my hat on that, for lack of better terms, and it's been paying off. I think we're going to continually see like WordPress is still going to be kind of the dominant CMS platform. I don't think that's going to be going away anytime soon, even though some people are saying like, oh, this is the death of WordPress. I do think that over the next couple of years, a lot more people are going to kind of adopt this approach of building websites and web apps and things like that, because it'll like the more and more this gets adopted by bigger brands and some of the more respected agencies and things like that, the more people are going to be like, okay, well, CSS Tricks is using it, so I guess that means like it's good for us, or like Netflix is using it, so if it's good enough for them, then it's definitely good enough for us. Um, I also kind of envision WordPress kind of feeding a little bit off on this and evolving over time to maybe provide some of the main benefits. So they've already kind of provided a way for you to decouple the actual CMS admin portion and the front end website portion. So you can almost do the same things as with the Jamstack approach. So I think WordPress is going to continue to evolve, and this will continue to evolve. I don't think in the foreseeable future there's going to be like one takeover or another takeover. And inevitably there's going to be another platform or way of doing things that'll come up, and then everyone will be like, oh, those other two ones, what are they doing? Like, this is the way to go.
Got it, got it. And comment here from Jonathan about security.
Yep. Jonathan, how secure is a Jamstack site? Ridiculously secure. So typically, like SSL certificates are out of the box with most of the tools that you use. Because we're not fetching data from a server, you no longer have kind of that possibility for a scripting attack, or one of the biggest issues I know with WordPress is people tend not to update plugins or WordPress versions or PHP. So it's a lot easier to attack that. And because you don't really have to deal with plugins or server information from the Jamstack approach, it's definitely, I do think it's more secure, but you definitely can make it less secure than any other site. So as long as you follow the best practices, you're good to go. Like with WordPress, you keep all your plugins updated, you keep WordPress updated. I don't think you're really at risk for as much of a security threat. So cool.
I think real quick about security would be, unlike a traditional website, if you're hosting with like a GoDaddy or something of that nature, which we advise against, especially WordPress, would be that you're not necessarily on these servers with thousands of other sites.
Yep.
So if one gets hacked and you have a vulnerability, you could get hacked and just becomes kind of this snowball effect. So you're saying that kind of eliminates the server being, you're not hosted with all these other sites.
So I think you still are kind of hosted with a bunch of other sites, but because it's like you're serving up static HTML and pre-rendered content, there's less of a chance of somebody using the same thing that they used on WordPress site A over on your site on WordPress site B. So I personally haven't run into any instances of that. I don't know too much about that. I do think it is easier to kind of set up your hosting with a Jamstack site, because you don't need to run like a PHP server or Apache or things like that. You just kind of throw it up wherever somebody has access to internet and you're good to go. Jonathan, can Jamstack be hosted anywhere, or where is a good host for Jamstack? I didn't mention that before. Jamstack sites, you really can host them just about anywhere, as long as you can upload a file. Really, that's really the requirement. The web already can read HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So as long as you have somewhere to put that file, you can upload it. I think one of the better platforms out there would be something like a Netlify or a Versal, where these platforms are kind of built specifically for this Jamstack approach and kind of all the tooling that comes with it. And you're more than welcome to pick my brain on Slack. I love talking about this stuff.
So Ed, you've been doing this for a few years now, building on Jamstack. How does someone get started, besides for following the links? Find a developer like yourself. If they're like, okay, I'm interested, I have a bigger project, I want there to be flexibility. How does someone get going?
Yeah, I think just really picking any of the platforms that are out there and running through their getting started documentation would be the best way to go. I think that does one of two things. One, you kind of get your brain wrapped around the whole concept of like, you make your pre-render it, and then it's uploaded, and now there's no like servers to manage or anything like that. And the other thing is like all of these getting started guides on these platforms are really pretty thorough. So if you run through one of those, I think you'll have a pretty good feel for it. And you don't necessarily need to like take your entire business off of whatever you're using and go, make this huge change. You could even take like a small slice of it and test it out and see if this is something that'll work for you.
That makes sense. So are there any communities, Jonathan looks like he's asking, like
Yep.
jam camps, like WordCamps?
Yeah. I don't know if they're called jam camps. I know there's like, so each of the major platforms out there, let's say like Netlify or Versal, Jamstack organization, they all kind of have multiple conferences throughout the year that they host. So I think those would kind of be the equivalent of WordCamps. And then there's like thousands of Slack communities, online communities, different local networking events, kind of the same ecosystem that exists around WordPress and WordCamps is sprung up around this idea of Jamstack and things like that.
Okay, great. Well, this was incredibly helpful. I've been hearing a little bit about it, and it's nice to have someone who's been working in it kind of explain it in more detail and how it can work for just any business, really. So, Ed, I really appreciate you coming on and doing the Lunch and Learn today. How can someone find out more information about you?
Sure. If you're at the Candy Factory, you can always message me on the Slack channel. Other than that, you can send an email to me if you want. I'm always happy to chat, and that's just Edward at doc, like a boat doc 90.io. So that's probably like the easiest ways. I'm usually in Slack all the time, and I like email.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Ed, thanks so much. It'll be good to see you in person at some
Yeah,
point when you're back in Lancaster. And thanks for everyone for joining us today. And if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. Even if we couldn't get them answered today, Ed can probably check the comments and respond back or hit him up in Slack if you're a part of the Candy Factory community, which if you want to be part of the Candy Factory community, you can check us out at coworkinginlancaster.com. We have some awesome memberships starting at $10 a month to join and be part of our community. So Ed's been here for years, and we appreciate his expertise and sharing of knowledge today. So thank you, Ed. This was really, really helpful.
yeah. Thanks, Ann. Thanks for having me on.
Have a good one, everyone.